As much as we would like to think, our brains are not computers. We are mammals, and we evolved in the middle of the food chain, and our nervous system is configured in a very particular way. And it has different levels of organization called threat responses, and it matters what the state of our nervous system is. Nervous system is not functioning the same all the time. And so it's important to learn how it's structured and when you're in the different parts of your nervous system. So today we're going to get into that, and we're going to learn all about regulation and dysregulation, fight or flight, freeze, and what the biology of it all is and why that matters. So there are lots of ways that our nervous system could be structured, but actually there's an evolutionary pathway that has got us to where we are, and there are different levels of, you could say, consciousness or different levels of intelligence systems that are operating, and we have some of the ancient threat response systems still inside of us. And the oldest of these is the shutdown, playing dead or conserving energy and lying very still. That's been with us 500 million years. Before we had any other defenses, playing dead was our first defense, and that's our ultimate fallback. Basically, it's a kill switch for the entire system. And that's known as the dorsal vagal complex within something called polyvagal theory. But it's just a theory, and all we need to think of it as is basically the freeze system or the shutdown system. Then the next system that we evolved was the sympathetic nervous system or the darting system, where as small fish, we mobilized energy to move quickly to avoid threats. And this system basically overrides the other defense, and it's either to fight back or to run away. Both of them require this kind of energy wave, and there are slightly different ways that those are mobilized, which we'll get into. But the important thing here is that it's movement, it's energy, and it's a kind of shortcut defense system. And adrenaline is involved in that, the HPA axis, there's a whole system for it. And the third major defensive system we have is the ventral vagal complex, which is basically our rest and digest and social engagement system. And it's the way mammals downregulate anxiety, and we look for safety in others. We're very good at detecting social cues, and it's a very quick pathway, and it inhibits the older defenses. So through touch and eye contact, body language, we can downregulate our anxiety or upregulate it if needed. If someone else in the group has spotted a predator, we'll pick that up from their social system, and then that will mount a defense. Basically, will bring in sympathetic energy. So we have this layered architecture where the mammalian system is the most adaptable and dynamic, and it's the one we try to use. It's the one that's in health mostly operating. And then we fall back to these older mobilization and immobilization strategies. So we're going to talk about stress cycles. Sometimes this is called pendulation, or moving through activation and deactivation. So whenever we look at the world, we're always assessing for safety. There's an unconscious process inside of our nervous system called neuroception. And neuroception is identifying sources of threat. And if it finds those, it mobilizes one of the defensive systems. So anything with a positive emotional valence in blue here signals safety, and we can approach it. It helps to sustain rest, digest, and immune function type activities. We also play and cooperate, nurture and love, tend and befriend, and we have our full nervous system online here. When we're safe, we're thriving and at our best. When there's threat in the environment, we withdraw, and our energy system activates. We aren't the threat, and we either have a fight or flight response or a freeze response, or one of the newer defensive responses that's come in is fawning, which basically means using social engagement to placate the predator. And when we're in these threat responses, we're typically using old reactive patterns to deal with threat. We're not inventing new ways of doing things, or we don't have much access to creativity or memory. So we're in older threat responses. Not anatomically correct schematic here, which basically shows when we're dysregulated in a threat response, we're using a shortcut emergency module in the brain around the amygdala and the hippocampus and some particular pieces of memory to deal with threat. And most of our nervous system is offline and not engaged. And so that's why we miss so much when we're in an anxious state or in fight or flight. We really are in just a small part of our brain. And when we are able to downregulate and get into a regulated state, so that's when the parasympathetic comes online and we're able to drop in. Then our entire brain comes online and we are more available, more present. We have better access to our memory, both read and write. We can take in more information and we can mount more sophisticated responses, and we're connected to creativity, wisdom, and intuition. And when we're in a regulated state, we really can trust our thinking. When we're dysregulated, we probably shouldn't trust our thinking. As we've said before, story follows state. We can get to the state where more of our nervous system is online, our thinking will be better. And I often have clients distrust their thinking in general and miss this fact that sometimes their thinking is not trustworthy, where it's very fear-based and missing certain aspects of the environment. And then other times they're thinking, when they're in a very rested, downregulated place, their thinking really is trustable. And so understanding this is very important. An important aspect of trauma is that when we've been traumatized and our body is in a dysregulated place, we see humans as a threat generally, because humans are pretty dangerous creatures. So it makes sense that we have a tendency to see people as a threat. But it overgeneralizes when we've been exposed to something traumatic, or there was adversity in our childhood, or there was not enough emotional support or holding. Humans have come to represent danger, and we're no longer even looking for signs of safety. On the left there, everyone is a threat. Even when some of the expressions could signal safety, those signals are missed. And then when we're regulated, we start to be able to parse facial expressions, and suddenly we can tell who really is a threat and who is an ally. And we're able to identify resources in the environment and have the appropriate level of vigilance for the threatening people that are around. But we are no longer seeing humans as a generic threat, but humans become mostly safe, except for the humans that really aren't safe. So the red event here on the left represents a trauma that basically sensitizes fear and creates a trigger in the nervous system. And then when we're triggered, we can easily move up beyond the top of our window of tolerance. The band going from left to right is the window of tolerance. So when we get triggered, we go up into the stuck on position, panic, rage, hyperactivity, hypervigilance, mania. And that can last for days. In the case of mania, it could last for hours or even just minutes. And a lot of the protectors are in this kind of stuck on body posture. So when our sympathetic arousal is high, we have less self-energy and we're more in protective responses. Eventually that takes a lot of energy, and usually if we're stuck on for some time, there'll be stuck off parts in the cycle. And when we're stuck off, we're in freeze, which is, you can think of it as the protector of last resort. And there we have depression, disconnection, hopelessness, exhaustion, collapse. And it's not uncommon for someone to alternate between those two states, or someone might have a tendency to be stuck on or stuck off. And they have a home base where they live, where they spend most of their time, and it becomes a kind of identity. So you can represent the same sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic deactivation with one of these Hoberman spheres. Basically, when we are aroused, our system expands, and when we collapse, our system goes down. And after traumatic events, or if there wasn't enough support in our childhood, our system might be frequently in an off position. And then there might be just a little bit of range, but we're missing a lot of the dynamic range that should be there. Or we might use substance to get into a very wide, expanded place, and then there's a kind of backlash to that, and we go into a very contracted place, but there's a kind of spikiness to our nervous system, or it just lives in one place, either stuck off or stuck on. Through a lot of trauma work, our goal is to increase our range and then allow to find a rhythm. We're always expanding or contracting. That's healthy. And when the environment calls for it, we can mount energy. Maybe that's for a project or some kind of conquest. And then when that's over, we let the system come down and the system's able to rest. And then the system will just have its own natural rhythm like that. So that's what we're working toward. We look at that diagrammatically. In health, we're moving within the window of tolerance through kind of charge and discharge sequences. So we're able to ride the wave without getting overwhelmed or getting pushed outside of our window of tolerance. And our system is dynamic and adjusting up and down, and stress cycles are able to complete. If we get stuck on, stress cycles are not able to complete, and then energy is trapped in the body, and that becomes accumulated stress, or what's known as allostatic load, the amount of stress that's carried by the organism. And that's basically trauma, and that creates more spikiness in our energetic pattern. When we are able to complete stress cycles, we become more and more able to stay within this window of tolerance. One thing I want to just point out as well is this window of tolerance is nice and wide. Going back after trauma, the window of tolerance starts to shrink so that we tend to either be in the stuck on or the stuck off position. We're easily overwhelmed. We can't stay, there's not much of a healthy range where we can live. So here's a schematic that shows basically the 3 parts of polyvagal theory, which is parasympathetic in blue, rest or digest, sympathetic arousal or activation in red, fight or flight, and dorsal vagal or freeze. And the y-axis here is arousal level. As we get aroused, we get triggered by something, we have a defensive orienting response. We start by trying to use social engagement, then we go to fight or flight. If that fails, the system shuts down, goes to freeze. And we've drawn it at the top here. You could have freeze drop down to a very low level of energy. It happens when we're very aroused, but then it shuts down the system to a low level of arousal. And what's important here is the discharge on the right. That's an essential part of what we're doing in SE work. And allowing your system to come down is a very important aspect of the work. Systems can easily get disrupted, particularly by thinking and protective responses, and then they're never allowed to come down. So the bound survival energy is trapped within the system and it can't release, it can't discharge. We're going to go through each of these in detail now. So this is where we start on the wave. We're still socially connected, we're relaxed, moving fluidly, and there's prosody in our voice, which means our voice is able to go up and down, and we're communicating safety through the way that our voice sounds. We have soft, wide vision, so we're able to take in everything in our environment. There's joy, laughter, fun, play, and our digestion is relaxed and functioning, and we'll hear gurgles, which are known as borborygmuses or borborygmi, if that is the plural. And our facial expressions become responsive. Then if we get triggered, we'll have an orienting response that's moving the head and neck around looking for danger. And depending on what the danger is, our body will go into either fight or flight. People have a tendency toward one or the other generally. If you were able to fight back as a child, then fight is preferred. It's higher up the defensive hierarchy. If you were not able to fight back, you were typically overwhelmed in your childhood, or there was someone more powerful than you, then flight might become the default. So we tend to run. And it has very similar physiology on both of them. One difference is fight tends to be more of the arms, and flight tends to be more of the legs. So kind of energy goes to the arms in fight, and energy goes to the legs in flight. So moving through on the left, there are some of the body markers of fight or flight. The heart accelerates, breathing quickens, dry mouth, sweating, hypervigilance, we're looking around a lot. Facial muscles contract, pupils dilate, eyelids retract, so our eyes look wide, muscles brace, skin is pale and cold, blood flows to arms and legs, impulse control diminishes, so we have less ability to control ourselves. Voice becomes monotonous, ears tune for predators, digestion stops. So that's a hallmark feature there, where the digestion clamps up because the body is conserving energy for the defensive action. Now at the top of the wave, if we can't defend ourselves or run away, the body shuts down to conserve energy. And this is where we experience the feeling of trapped, helplessness, shame, and we're overwhelmed up here. And major traumas almost always involve this type of experience where we're in immobility and we can't respond to a threat. And that's the biggest disruption to our nervous system when that happens. And it's like the brake and the accelerator are on at the same time. We shut down, but often there's energy that's trapped inside of us. There might be muscle tension or stored energy that wants to release later. And one alternative to freeze is fold, which is more of a kind of flaccid collapse. Freeze is a more tense, rigid way of responding where the muscles are locked in place. So reading down the left there, we conserve energy, we shut down all of the vital systems. There's hypovigilance, which means we lose track of the environment. Vacant stare, hopelessness, depression, dissociation, numbness, increased pain tolerance, and the muscles are frozen or flaccid. And I just want to highlight the dissociation there. Whenever we're dissociating, our body is in a physiological freeze and we're disconnected from the body. And so even, this may be pleasurable, we may enjoy dissociating, but it is a trauma response. Then if we are safe enough and the conditions are right, we're able to discharge bound survival energy, and we're able to complete stuck motions that were interrupted when we were in danger. Often there's shaking and tingling and heat and energy discharge in waves from the core to the periphery. And often there's a kind of energetic buildup in the hands, the feet, the scalp, water in the eyes, yawning, the digestion loosens and restarts, a gurgle will happen, our vision softens and widens, and we take in more color, we're just taking in more information again. Human voices become audible, our ears are no longer tuned for predators, our muscles relax, color returns to the skin, facial expressions return, and tiredness is felt. And we're going to look at some animal videos that show some discharge happening in the animal kingdom. These are all things that I've seen similar human correlates. Often in somatic sessions, this type of shaking or discharge will happen. So this is a famous video of a polar bear being tranquilized from a helicopter that's been shown in a lot of somatic experiencing trainings. The bear was not hurt, but it was stressful, and after the incident the bear shakes it off here. So this is a common stress discharge that animals do after stressful encounters. You see it starting to relax there, and the breathing becomes normal again. And that's a normal completion of a stress cycle. The bear is now not holding that stress. Here we see a leopard jumping off an impala. The impala's in a freeze response. If you see a few minutes earlier, the head kind of lolls back and forwards. And now the breathing is coming back. Often there's a burst of energy when you come out of freeze because you come back into sympathetic arousal, and it's starting to shake off the stress. So it has to kind of get through this, shake off kind of all the trapped energy in its system before it can run away. So it's finishing its stress cycle here, and you can see it's starting to slow down. It's starting to become more rhythmic, more coherent as it starts to move toward regulation. And it's continuing. And then it's ready, and now it can move, and again the animal has completely discharged that survival stress. Here we're watching a lion, and it was chasing a wildebeest that got away, and it's incurred some stress in that encounter, and here it is completing the actions, the running, the chasing. It's completing the interrupted actions and discharging through shaking and trembling all of the stress of the encounter. And you'll see it starts off kind of with the interrupted movements, then it goes into kind of incoherent shaking, and then slowly it becomes more coherent as the lion is gradually coming more and more back into a regulated state. And here you see it's now in parasympathetic, just kind of resting, able to continue. And this is a sled dog that's been running, and it's now releasing the energy from that sympathetic arousal through trembling. And finally, once discharge is completed, we come back into rest and digest, and then there's social engagement. We experience awe, wonder, fun, laughter, play, and we get curious again. So that's the wave of arousal that comes through: activation, deactivation, and just learning to identify where you are in that wave pattern can be very helpful. So noticing, when are you activated? When are you in the red zone? And when are you dissociated or collapsed or in freeze, in the light blue zone? And then as you notice that more and more, your system is able to complete these stress cycles so that you're able to spend more time in the blue zone. Here's another quick chart delineating sympathetic and parasympathetic by organ. And you can just think of sympathetic here as the accelerator and parasympathetic as the brake. And if you want to pause and go through that, you can see specifically what the body changes are. Here we're adding in the freeze system, which is part of the parasympathetic. We're basically just showing the three different states: in the red zone, fight or flight; in the blue zone, parasympathetic; or in the light blue zone, freeze. The enteric nervous system is very important in somatic work, and often what we're doing is bringing more of the enteric system online. And the enteric system is innervated mostly by the vagus nerve. It's around the digestion or GI tract, and it's often called the second brain, the largest secondary area of neurons in the body. And it's equivalent to a cat's brain, which is funny. And there are more nerves in the enteric nervous system than the entire spinal cord. The other interesting thing is that 80% are sensory or afferent nerves, so they carry information from the digestive tract up to the brain, and 20% of the nerves are efferent or motor nerves, which go from the brain to the gut. So mostly we're getting information from our gut. It's not that the brain is controlling. The gut area is its own center of intelligence that is informing the brain of something. And it's also interesting that the vagus nerve can be severed and this area remains functioning. It does a lot of what it needs to do without any direction from the brain. This is an area that produces and controls a lot of neurochemicals, 90% of our body's serotonin and 50% of the body's dopamine. And those neurotransmitters are used in all kinds of digestive function, and mood is often related to digestion. Carbohydrates are a very easy way to boost your mood, for instance. But the important thing here is that we're getting a lot of information from our gut and our heart. See, there's a branch there that goes to the heart. And this information is informing the brain of what is being detected in the environment by the broader nervous system. The nervous system uses the body as a theater to communicate to the brain. The nervous system uses the organs as a signaling to the brain. There are a lot of automatic processes that, for instance, switch on and off digestion that signal safety or danger to the brain. And evolution just chose to work this way. It's strange, but it's how the brain works. And so the body is not trivial in terms of nervous system function. Now I'm going to look at a trauma model, which is the river of life, which explains basically how traumatic incidents affect the nervous system on an ongoing basis. So when a river passes through steep ground or cliffs, the boulders and cliffs cause turbulence in the water. And in this model, you can think of those external factors like the gradient and the boulders as trauma. And the effect on the water is the way that trauma is experienced internally or subjectively, and the way that emotions, thoughts, and sensations are affected. And one of the important things on this chart is that even when we've gone through a rocky patch, the turbulence may still be in the water for some time. And time does heal trauma to some extent with enough containment. And if we can be in flat ground for long enough, the turbulence patterns will work themselves out. We can do things to accelerate that. This is a diagram of the river of life. So the blue band there is the river of life. When a boulder kind of disrupts the water, our brain basically splits off information. What happens is the brain goes offline and we're not able to store memory properly, and we go into some kind of shortcut defensive response, and a whole bunch of material is stored away in a fragmented way, separate to our main body of consciousness, which is the river of life, the blue stream. So this vortex of information is separated off from the mainstream. And those become the things that trigger us, things we possibly don't even remember, but caused some kind of disruption in our life. And so there's this energy system that pulls us away from the river, and traumas tend to cluster. Trauma vortex may consist of a whole number of traumatic events that happen that are related and have a similar body state to them, either fight, flight, or freeze. The other important thing is that on the left there in that trauma vortex, these unprocessed memories, which are known as implicit memories versus explicit or narrative memories, these unprocessed raw memories are bottled up or stored for reintegration later when it's safer. At the same time as this vortex separates off from our river of life, a counter vortex forms, which is our tendency toward health. Even when we've been traumatized, there may be some parts of our life where we're able to soothe ourselves, we're able to get into a regulated state. And so there's this kind of counter tendency which brings trauma back into the stream of life. The more we're able to soothe or get into these regulated states, the more we're able to reintegrate fragmented traumatic memory. And in somatic work, we're often moved between safety and threat. We'll often go through a traumatic encounter where we talk through what happened, and we'll keep touching into safety in the current room, safety that may have come later in the story. What we're doing is integrating what's been fragmented and split off from the river of life. We're bringing it back into the narrative and using the inner healer and these regulated states to create enough containment to bring fragmented information back into the river of life. Every time we go through a stress cycle, we get triggered and we go into the trauma vortex. And if there's enough containment, if we're in therapy or if we're able to soothe ourselves or there's enough support, we move through the stress cycle and we get to the regulated place. And each time we do that, what's known as pendulating, which is just moving through the stress cycle, we're slowly stitching together that trauma vortex back into the river of life. So every time we move through a stress cycle with enough support, we start to re-bring the trauma vortex into the stream of life. There's a concept in somatic experiencing known as titration, which is we just have to do a little bit at a time. We don't want to get flooded. There may be a lot that's very scary in a traumatic memory, and it might be enough to just say the headline of the memory at first or go into one of the less troubling aspects. And slowly we build safety. And as we complete smaller stress cycles, we become more and more able to get to the center of the trauma vortex or the thing that carries the most charge. And over time, we're able to titrate all of that traumatic material. And so it becomes less and less of a fragmented aspect of our nervous system, and it becomes integrated. This diagram shows, similar to what we were just looking at, a trauma vortex and the counter vortex or inner healer. And before healing, there's been some kind of fragmentation. There's information that's outside of our consciousness, outside of the river of life. And as we heal, as we integrate that information, the river of life expands. And the width of the river of life is our window of tolerance. So when we're overwhelmed, then we lose presence and awareness, and we are in a trauma vortex. And as the river gets wider, we're able to ride stress waves without becoming overwhelmed. And so the river of life has expanded, the window of tolerance has expanded. Here's another diagram showing before healing, when we had been traumatized and dysregulated, our window of tolerance may be narrow, and so the wave is not contained. And so a lot of it is experienced as a problem and traumatic. And then as we heal, our window of tolerance widens, and so we can ride the wave or surf the urge all the way down into parasympathetic, and our window of tolerance can hold most of our life, and it becomes more of a rarity that we get triggered outside of the window. As we do this work, we uncouple the automatic defensive mechanisms that bind us. And as we do that, more and more possibilities emerge. We no longer do things automatically. We find that we're able to use different defensive ways to cope, and we can become more sophisticated and develop more range. And so we are no longer as bound. Our nervous systems are more dynamic. And then as we do this, more and more we gain freedom. And I've defined it here as conscious awareness of self and other. We're in contact with our emotional pain. We're not disavowing it or ignoring it. We have healthy self-esteem and boundaries. We're able to pause, choose, adapt. We're sensitive to a broad range of feelings, and we're not dependent on substances. There are many more things you could put there. And that compares to a more protected or defensive way of being, where trauma is dictating the response in the nervous system. And when trauma is dominating, there are unconscious projections, false defensive selves, reactiveness, rigidity, we're frozen and insensitive. There's shame and imposter syndrome, and there's a lot of fear sensitization. So fear is dominating. So that's an overview of the nervous system. And the important thing is that with enough containment and safety, we are able to move through stress cycles into a place where there's parasympathetic or self-energy. And in that place, we're more able to find safety in the environment and with others. We have a more dynamic and flexible range of options.